This session is titled Using VoiceThread for Purposeful Design of Online Conversations, and I am pleased to introduce Chrystal Dean and Tracy Goodson-Espy from Appalachian State University as our hosts today. So without further ado, you may begin when you're ready.
Thank you, Kelly. Hi, I'm Chrystal. I'm Tracy. And we are both math educators here in the Department of Curriculum Instruction at Appalachian State. And we worked on a design experiment involving VoiceThread in 2 different courses. And we're each going to talk about different things that we focused on and how we used VoiceThread in the design of certain conversations from our classes. So the first thing when we were looking at design, the way we typically design for both instruction as well as experiments is a design called backward design from understanding by design. And a typical backward design process, first you think about what your learning outcomes are, and then the next step is determining how you're going to assess whether or not you've met those outcomes. And then you decide what your learning experiences or your tasks are going to be for that particular class. And it's backward for what most people typically do. Most people decide on a book or a task and then see what learning objectives are met by that task. And so this backward design starts with the learning objectives instead of starting with the task. But we found that this design process was a bit limited when we started looking at hybrid or online environments, especially synchronous, asynchronous with the online. We needed to be able to take the environment into account. And so we started using what we're calling backward design plus. And that helps us look at the learning context, whether it is face-to-face or online or some blending of those, because we need to take that into account when we're thinking about the acceptable evidence, how we're going to assess, as well as the tasks that we are designing to meet those learning objectives. So in both of those situations, the learning context has an influence on what those things look like. So because of this environment, I had a hybrid environment and Tracy had a fully online environment. We decided to use VoiceThread as our tool for these 2 courses. Now, it's a learning tool that's specific for asynchronous conversations around media, and the website, if you go to VoiceThread, they talk about it, their definition of media is very broad, and they talk about it's being able to use 50 different types of media with this. And so the commenting that you could do on this, the reason that we chose this is is the commenting you can do in text, or video, or a text-based discussion board. We needed something much more powerful for mathematics. So we chose VoiceThread for that as opposed to other types of discussion environments. Now with VoiceThread, there are 3 basic types of assignments. There's a watch assignment, a create assignment, and a comment assignment. So to introduce the students, the first thing, the watching assignment, we actually embedded a tutorial on VoiceThread as their first assignment. So their first assignment, they had to watch a tutorial on how to use VoiceThread. So it forced them to get into the program whether they wanted it or not. And then the create assignment, they had to create using some media, where it was a document or a video or whatever the case may be. And they had to present to everyone else the difference between a misconception and an error. And then the commenting assignment, I presented them with a problem that an elementary student had done and asked them if what the student had done, because they got an incorrect answer, if it was based off of an error or a misconception. And then they had to comment on the thing that I loaded up as to which of those 2 things it was. And so they could have conversations with me as well as each other about that situation. So again, we chose VoiceThread pragmatically. We chose it because it's a cloud-based application, so the students didn't have to load any software onto their computers. And it's seamlessly incorporated with our LMS. We use Moodle here at Appalachian State, but it can be integrated with any LMS. But it also works with our gradebook system, and it's automatic as one of our assignment sets. And so it was really easy for us to incorporate. And because a typical discussion board just wasn't sufficient, when students are talking about their mathematical thinking, we need them to do what we call think alouds. And in order to do that, they have to be able to document what they're thinking and justify it and share it with other people, whether that's using manipulatives or drawings or whatever the case may be. They're comparing and contrasting their reasoning with someone else. They're building on someone else's thinking. And so a typical discussion board just wasn't powerful enough to do what we needed to do. And we also looked for a literature base, and you can see here a few articles that we found that were specific to using VoiceThread in our type of environments. And so we would build on that as well, so that we have both a pragmatic background as well as a theoretical background as to why we chose VoiceThread. But also embedded with choosing VoiceThread was in that backward design model. So starting with our overarching learning focus, for my particular class, I taught a summer master's content and methods course. So it was an advanced mathematics methods course where we teach both content and pedagogy. And so the content focus was on mathematical misconceptions. So for example, let's say if I teach that a rectangle has 2 long sides and 2 short sides, then that means that a square could never be a rectangle. So a misconception, as opposed to an error, can lead to lots of problems later on when they're trying to make connections to other mathematical topics. And then the pedagogical focus was on whole class discussions, both us having them and them learning how to have them within their class, because whole class mathematical discussions get messy. And so we need to learn more about how to do them. So based on that learning focus, and you'll know those aren't written the way objectives are written, because it's just to give you a kind of a holistic kind of view of what I was trying to accomplish in the course. The 2 summative assessments, the 2 major summative assessments that we had was a misconceptions paper, where they would choose some type of mathematical misconception, and they would speak to what the misconception was, what led to it, and what a teacher could do to help students get over the misconception. And then there were intentional talk templates, and these are templates set up to have very intentional, not scripted, but very intentional and thoughtful whole class discussions. So it was a 50-50 class. I had 50% face-to-face and 50% asynchronous online, and it rotated. I had a day of face-to-face and a day of online, day of face-to-face, day of online, and it was very compressed in a summer environment. So the 2 texts that I use, so if you're thinking about backward design, we started with our learning focus, then how we're assessing, and then thinking about the tasks, I chose what tools that would help me with those tasks. I had the Math Misconceptions book, as well as an intentional talk book from some of our math ed colleagues. And the technology I chose, again, was VoiceThread, because it did best at supporting me getting to those learning objectives that I wanted to accomplish. So you can see here what a typical cycle would look like. On the face-to-face day, we always had some sort of conversation about a specific mathematical misconception. And then we went through one of the intentional talks, and I modeled that type of intentional talk based on work they had done on that mathematical misconception. So I wanted everything connected. Then they would do a mathematical task that was specific to the misconception, or that would introduce the next type of content area that we were going to do. And then they would have an online assignment that they would do for homework, and they would do a create or a comment math task, and then they would have an intentional talk template that they did on Moodle. And then the online day, the mathematical task solutions, they each looked at each other's solutions, and they were guided with a specific purpose for looking at it, and then they would comment on their solutions, and then they would comment on an intentional talk template based on those solutions. And then, of course, they had their next readings when they read from the intentional talk book and the misconceptions book, and they would answer questions online for that. I followed this model mainly because I wanted to bridge. I didn't want face-to-face days to be this separate entity from the asynchronous days. And VoiceThread was a wonderful bridge for when I'm designing this from face-to-face to online, back to face-to-face. It was a nice bridge between those two instructional environments. So some affordances from using VoiceThread. Each student's mathematical reasoning was made public. So in a face-to-face context, students are only exposed to each other's mathematical reasoning if they're partnered with a student or a specific student is brought to the board to share. But with VoiceThread, everyone's reasoning is made public if I want it to be. And the students' think alouds are either directed to me specifically or they can be shared with classmates. The thing that was most powerful with VoiceThread is it gave voice to students that don't typically share their work, even though it could be some really powerful mathematical thinking or pedagogical thinking. They're very introverted or shy, and they don't tend to share their reasoning. Also, the think alouds from each pre-service teacher, that's what PST stands for here, sorry about that, produces a diverse range of student reasoning for me to use in my whole class discussions, integrating that intentional talk. And from a research perspective, we love VoiceThread because all the student contributions were automatically documented, whether it was voice or written or whatever the case may be, so that we could use it later for data analysis. So what you see here is just a snapshot of a student using, so one of the assignments they had was to show me two or three ways to do a multiplication problem, a double-digit multiplication problem. And so what you see here is just a screen capture from VoiceThread, and the student has annotated, so they've posted it up onto VoiceThread, but then they've gone back with a pen that's in VoiceThread to talk through their reasoning. And this is what makes VoiceThread so powerful, is the student's able to talk through what they did. It's not just a picture of the student's work without any explanation going to it. And so you see here the student annotating her thinking, why she thinks those multiplication algorithms work. And then on the left, the green button there that you see with AR, that's the student's initials, so that I can click on that part to hear the student's specific comments about a certain place within the VoiceThread that she created. So for an example of a limitation that we had, the following class, following the one where they did the multiplication problems, we asked students to review other students' methods from the VoiceThread from session 6. The original plan I had was to have the students pick two solutions to compare and contrast and ask how they all use the distributive property. So the limitation here, and this was because I was new to VoiceThread, was editing permissions. So in other words, I couldn't edit anything the students did or pick certain ones for them to look at. And they had to, from the beginning, put it so that everyone could see it, not just me. And so I had to learn to do that ahead of time. But because I didn't know at this point, I had to come up with a plan B. And so plan B, so that I'm still reflecting back on those learning objectives, that I uploaded a file myself demonstrating some of their methods, the area model and the standard algorithm. And I asked the students to do a commenting assignment where they compared and contrasted those two methods and to speak specifically of the connection and progression between the area model and the standard algorithm. Then they would read the intentional talk chapter on comparing and connecting, because that met with this. So I was combining that mathematical misconception type of thing with the whole class discussion. And then they read the next chapter on misconceptions with multiplication. And this is an example of the students using VoiceThread to explain that connection between them. And I made this one a little larger picture of VoiceThread so you could see some of the advantages. On the left over here, you can see each student, there's a block with their initials. And so I could click on that particular student if I wanted to hear just what they said. This is me, and I am at the picture there at the top where I am presenting the problem to them. And down here on the bottom, I could go all the way through listening to each student, or I could go to particular students in particular places. I could comment on what they say back to them if I'd wanted to. And you can see these underlined parts. That's where the student was using the pen that's in VoiceThread while she talked through her reasoning. So the limitation that we had with not being able to edit or these type of things, I had to come up with workarounds for this. The limitation with who is shared to and who can edit, including the instructor. The workarounds that we had is I used Screencast-O-Matic to capture video that I wanted to share that was their specific reasoning. If I didn't have, if I couldn't edit it, I could still use it. And then, of course, learning from the beginning to ask the students to share it with the entire class and to give editing privileges to me, because once they create a VoiceThread, it's their own. And the only way I can edit it is if they make me one of the editors on it. And it was really simple workarounds, and it had more to do with me learning more about VoiceThread itself than anything else. And now I'm going to move this over to Tracy, and she's going to talk about the second context that we use VoiceThread.
Hello, everybody. The second context that we use VoiceThread, I was teaching a summer quantitative methods class, specifically an inferential statistics course. And so the content focus for that course was inferential statistics and also just general quantitative research design. And from a pedagogical standpoint, we were using SPSS to problem solve. And so the assessments included weekly problem sets and research design tasks. And then we also had a midterm and final. But the weekly problem tasks really formed the bulk of the work for the course. The class was fully online. It alternated between 1 week we would do it synchronously, and the following week would be asynchronous. And I had two texts that I was working from. One was a pretty traditional statistical reasoning book, and then the other one was a specific book, very hands-on, looking at how to use SPSS in order to do the types of analysis that we were studying in the other text. And for technology, we were using VoiceThread, SPSS, and Screencast-O-Matic, as Chrystal mentioned. So one of the things that I was looking at as my main focus here was how do students in a doctoral program in educational leadership experience and understand statistics and the application of SPSS in an online environment. So the challenge here was it is a tall order to make students very comfortable in a statistical environment, and then layering on the learning how to use the tool SPSS in order to do the work. That's challenging in a face-to-face environment, and I was trying to figure out how do I make this work in a way that they can be comfortable with in an online environment. And so one of the things that I used VoiceThread for was to record video introductions to each of the class sessions. And I did that both for the face-to-face, the synchronous sessions as well as the asynchronous, to just orient them. And it served really the same function that you might do in a face-to-face class, where you begin with an overview of, what's the goal, what are we trying to do, and then giving them an understanding of what the week's resources are going to be and what they were expecting. Just as some background for kind of the theory that was underlying the approach, we're working a lot with metacognition and basically, getting the students to think about not just, set and repeating what I was showing them how to do in terms of calculation, but for this to be useful to them in the doctoral context, they needed to be able to apply what they were learning. They needed not only to be able to run a test in SPSS, but also to be able to interpret and understand what they were seeing when the test was And we also use the think aloud approach to allow students to have the opportunity to talk about, what they were doing with the test and interpreting the results. And one of the historical weaknesses of think aloud in a face-to-face environment is the amount of time and the fact that it's hard to do that with individual students in a short class period. But in a VoiceThread environment and an asynchronous environment, you have more time for students to think aloud and share that thinking with you. Then it becomes also a matter of thinking about how to do that. So the typical instructional cycle is we had asynchronous screencast videos as the means of sharing information, as well as PowerPoint presentation. I also had some YouTube videos, particularly of the SPS process. And so I had the material that they were introduced to in asynchronous sessions. And then during the synchronous sessions, I returned to questions that came up in VoiceThread and looked at recurring themes that happened across the group. And we tried to then revisit those while we were together synchronously. And that allowed for a deeper exploration of topics that were giving them difficulty. So the screenshot that I'm showing here is just to give you a sense of the variety of tools that I was using to try to convey information. And so included both VoiceThread and Screencast-O-Matic. And so there were a whole variety of tools that I was using to try to convey information and assist them. So as Chrystal was talking about in the affordances, what we were able to do in this VoiceThread environment in her course, the same sort of thing was true in the statistics class. The Think Alouds allowed the students to explain to the instructor or classmates what they were doing, the parts of the assignments that they felt like they were understanding, or to bring attention to places where they were having difficulty. And that was true for both the mathematics and also for the application of the SPSS. It was useful too because students could also see, that they weren't the only one that perhaps was having difficulty with a problem, and it gave us the opportunity to leverage that in order to have good discussions. It's easy to show an instructor step-by-step what they're doing, and then to ask questions about implementation or interpretation. So this screenshot is showing, a data sheet from SPSS, and the comments down the side, you can see places, there's one that has TG, which is for me, and it has a lock on it. And then the CS is a student comment, and then the one on the bottom, TG without the lock. The difference is that I was able to respond privately to that student, and that's the one that has the lock on it. So that response, only the student would be able to see and hear. And then the other one would be open to the entire group. And so that, allows you to have one-on-one commentary with the student, a one-on-one private conference, as well as making comments on the work that would be shared with the group as a whole. Some limitations that we ran into. As Chrystal mentioned, VoiceThread is very powerful in the large number of different media that it will allow you to upload. Unfortunately, the one thing that it will not do that I needed for it to do is it would not allow students to directly upload SPS data files or the output files. And so the workaround that we used was that students could upload a screencast of what they were doing in Screencast-O-Matic or another tool, or they could share Word documents or others where they had embedded material that they copied from SPSS, because it's very easy to do that, to copy a screen or copy output. And so once they uploaded those types of files, then they were still able to annotate them with voice or video comments. And so it didn't really present that much of a limitation. And so this is an example of the output, and you can see this was just a SPSS that had been run, a t-test had been run in SPSS, and then below the notes, because you can also type directly into SPSS notes about interpretation and output. And so that was something that was being communicated to me at this point by the student. So one of the things that I think we noticed in both of these classes is that, you know, our purposeful design for online conversations in this VoiceThread environment had some results that were useful and would be helpful, you know, beyond mathematics classes. It was helpful for us in the building of an online community because it facilitated communication about the content, and particularly this was content that is sometimes difficult to convey and talk about in an online environment. As Chrystal mentioned, that there was, I think, a very deliberate inclusion of students that might otherwise stay on the margins because everyone had to contribute through the VoiceThread assignments. And it allowed instructors to be very sensitive about whether a student might need one-on-one private information, private tutorial information, or if they were going to be comfortable with the sharing of their work and discussion of their work in a more public setting. So it's very tailorable in that regard. One-on-one tutorial assistance is useful. And the modification of the course in progress, you know, we are able to better address student needs and maintain that focus on the original design of the main content and pedagogical goals. And in closing, I'll point you to an upcoming book chapter that we have coming out, and this will be published, the copyright date will be 2020, and this is the role of VoiceThread in supporting effective mathematical discussions online. So we're looking forward to that coming out. And we will be happy now to take any questions or comments that you might have.